Let the rebuild begin. So to do the reinstallation, I'm going to start with the bearings into the gearbox housing. And to do a lot of this pressing, I'm going to rely on the liberal usage of the wife's old hair dryer instead of an arbor press. What you do is you just heat up the aluminum, let it expand, and then drop a relatively cold steel bearing into it, and usually taps in pretty easy with a little bit of lube on it, and avoids a lot of beating and banging. Nice warm housing, a few love taps with the Garland #1, goes right together. Also, I'm using Permalube bearings where I can get them. They really help with the oil leakage problems down the road. They're kind of their own seal, plus they don't need to rely on the gearbox lube, so you can get away with a little bit less oil. Okay, seal. Brand new lip seal from Granger. Now in lip seals, you put the garter spring towards the oil. And it just taps right in, just like the bearings. Next, the bearing for the chain sprocket. More hair dryer treatment. You can use a heat gun or even a torch if you want, but the beauty about the hair dryer is it'll never get it so hot that you can't touch it. Whereas with a heat gun, if you turn it on there and then you go and grab it, you might be in for a surprise. So anyway, brand new bearing, a little bit of assembly lube, just a touch. And just a little bit of love tap, and in she goes. Followed by the snap ring. Okay, the needle bearing for the chain sprocket. Now the original had a needle bearing and a separate little seal, like that. We're using a brand new made in USA ENA with a little seal integrated right into it. See that little yellow band there? It's on the one side but not on the other. That's the hair dryer treatment. Okay, sealed down. Down is that way in this case. Nice and warm, little love tap from the nice and warm housing, little love tap from the Garland. And then the chain sprocket shaft just pushes right in. Just like that. I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit and just install the little bearing, the rear rotor support bearing. And that's also a Permalube, also brand new, same method, and just now I can't forget it. Tiny little woodruff key. Sometimes this needs a little bit of fitting, so just a piece of sandpaper on a flat surface and just a little bit of help from the persuader. Bronze gear with the collar up towards the bearing so that the little collar rides on the bearing race. This, remember, just pushes on manually. thin little nut. It's hard for my old fingers to grab. Okay, I used a hose clamp around this thing before to untorque it, but this time I'm just going to torque it basically hand tight. So I'm just wrapping the gear in the one hand and using a very good quality box wrench from Snap-on in the other, and just getting her snug. And there you go. Prepping for reinstalling the chain sprocket shaft, the little set screw. I'm just going to finger tight it for now. Reassembly of the gearbox begins with the rotor shaft. You just take the rotor shaft and insert it into the bearing. It just presses into the bearing. That's all it is. Then on the other side, you put in this thing called a slinger. I think I called it a bearing or a shaft support on the teardown video, but it's actually an oil slinger. It's supposed to prevent oil from collecting on the seal. That drops on. Then install the worm wheel. Little love tap from the garland. Okay, at this point, you want to look down the barrel here and make sure that the center of the worm wheel is aligned to the center of the rotor shaft, because that tells where the worm gear is going to ride. So I'll just do it visually here. Looks about good to me. So once you're there, snug down the set screw. Not super tight, just snug enough. Then take the worm gear and its right-hand thread, and you can just thread it on there, or you can just turn the chain sprocket, and it'll just draw it down. Then the 9/16 nut. And tighten it up. Again, not super tight, just snug. Nothing on this thing has got to be super tight. Okay, now the preload between that nut and the rear bearing is the only thing that keeps the worm gear from spinning inside the shaft. And that's it. That's all there is to it. And I'm spinning the rotor. You can see the worm wheel going around. That's all there is to it. Last piece of gearbox pre-assembly. The little grease cap or oil cap. I replaced the O-ring, the seal with a square O-ring. Just thread it in there. And I just run it down a little bit. I'll tighten that later after we fill it with oil. Step 1 for reassembling the motor housing. Reinstall the little set screws for the brushes. Just get them started. Step 2, reinstalling the brush holders. These insert from the outside. The inside has a little spring retainer groove and the outside is threaded. And just push them in, get them roughly correct, which is just sit them on a little collar in there and snug them up. We can adjust these later. Okay, all you need right now is for the little spring retainer grooves to be accessible on the inside of the motor housing. So just get them so these little retention grooves are inside the motor housing, so you can land the brush springs on them, and then just snug them up. Motor housing reassembly begins with installing the white brush wire, which goes on the left-hand brush holder, but it threads through from the front of the motor housing. And then you just snap it onto the brush holder. Very simple. And then I'm going to use the chopstick to push the crimp joint down. Okay. Motor winding. The two mounting holes obviously go on the mounting bosses, and the little black brush conductor goes on the right hand brush holder. So I'm going to start by threading the wires through to the front switch. So what I did is I finagled the short chopstick up from the bottom through a vent hole, grabbed the spring, at the same time shoved the longer chopstick through the brush holders through the spring, and then took the screwdriver and walked the spring onto the brush holder. Kind of a lot of finagling, but you get the hang of it. Okay, 2 screws hold the motor in. Get one started. Get it finger started. Get the other one started. Get it finger started. And run them down. Time to put the motor and the gearbox together. So what we're going to do is this bearing needs to go into that pocket, and we got to get the commutators between these brushes. Then we'll adjust the brushes. Fairly straightforward. This pilot engages inside the housing. Just pushes together. And then 2 of these 1/4-20 Philister heads. Aligning the brushes. So first, big screwdriver, get the brush holder, the opening in the brush holder parallel to the center line of the saw. And then just a little bent piece of wire to use as a clearance gauge. Stick it down between the brush holder and the commutator. And if the holder's too far in there, just pull it out a little bit. And then snug it down. Repeat on the other side. Okay, now if you did that right, you should be able to see the commutators moving without hanging up on the brush holders. So I'm going to turn the fan over here with the screwdriver very gently. So I don't want to bend the fan blades, but you can see the rotor's turning and the commutators are not hanging up on the brush holders. So we're okay to snug down the brush holders. Time for the brushes. They just drop in the brush holders after you clean all the oil off them from the oil mess that was in here. The brush cap goes on, and a little bit of finagling to find the threads. There we are. And just snug them down. Don't super tight them because you'll break these caps and you'll pay $5-6 a piece just for those caps. So go easy. Do the other. Okay, typically when I get the minimal electrical side of the tool reassembled, I like to test it to make sure everything's working. So what do I got over here? On this side, this is the feed. This is just a cord plugged into a plug strip, positive, negative. White and black, hooked up via little test leads to the speed selector switch and then to the motor down here. So I'm going to turn on the plug switch, or sorry, the power strip, and we should see the chain sprocket turning. Voila. Now I'm going to switch the speed switch and we should see it turning at a different speed. Son of a gun. And it's turning clockwise towards the camera, so the orientation is correct. So electrically we're good. To further demonstrate, I just loosely attached the lower wheel housing. There's the chain sprocket, and here's where the little shoe thingy mounts on the wheel housing. So the blade pulls towards the shoe. So in order for the blade to pull towards the shoe, the chain sprocket has to rotate clockwise relative to the camera. So just once again, I'm going to turn it on. And you can see it's rotating that way. So if it's rotating that way, the wheel's going that way, it's pulling the blade down into the shoe. So directionally, she's correct. Reassembly of the upper wheel housing begins with some lubrication. I just take this stuff. Stinks to high heaven, but works pretty good. And I spray it onto the surface of the upper wheel housing, the insides of the rail slots, the rails themselves, and the bottom of the motor housing pad. And then align the screw holes, and then the retainers fit on like so. And there you go. Slides back and forth. The spring retention pins, greased up with a little bit of the red and stinky grease and a Q-tip. Just snug them in. These roll pins right here do double duty. First thing they do is they provide stop for the eccentric that tensions the blade. Turn that with my hand. You can see hits there, hits there. Second thing they do is they limit the travel of the upper wheel housing. All the way loose, all the way tight. You also notice there's a cutout here, and so when the upper wheel axle goes in, that cutout has to be towards the eccentric. So when you're in the full tension position, you have clearance between the axle flange and the eccentric. Next, install the blade tensioning springs. Now on these, land the spreader bar with the angled end towards the top of the saw, the flat end towards the axle or the motor. And then lightly you can push those springs over the spring posts. Then take the axle and you can rock it in. Important note, cut out of the axle towards the eccentric. And then you can rock it into place. Like so. And then it is fastened down by 4 flathead Phillips screws. Just install them and run them down. When you get the first 2 screws put in, then turn the blade tensioning handle manually from underneath, and you can start the other 2 screws. And last step, snap ring. Make sure that it's seated. Yep. And there you go. So there's the tensioning springs in action. Okay, how does this actually work? So the blade tensioning handle is now in the rearward position, so the handle's pointing that way. You can see the eccentric moving as I turn the handle. This is in the released position. So the tension is off, and you can lean on the saw manually, and with a little bit of force you can move the upper wheel axle enough to get the blade off. But then when you turn the handle to the tensioned position, which is forward, you can see the eccentric came forward. Now these 2 springs are tighter than heck, and there's no way, you can really lean on that thing that you can remove the tension. So now the blade would be fully tensioned, and these 2 springs are holding the front wheel housing forward with a lot of force. It's not visually obvious when you first start looking at these things, but the spring spreader does bear directly on the axle. So that's part of this. Okay, lower blade housing, a little simpler. This hole just goes over this pilot. These 2 big beefy 5/16 flathead screws hold it down. So again, finger start them and then run them home. Lower axle, much like upper axle. Just gonna put a little WD on there. The cutout goes towards the blade, and it's visually obvious because you have this screw hole here, and the cutout creates clearance for that. Also held on by 4 little flathead Phillips screws. Just installed. Upper and lower roller assemblies. So 2 roller assemblies opposite hand, 2 bearings on each one, small holes, Phillips head screw, large hole, flathead shoulder screw. So down in the round pocket goes the bearing with the small hole. So little washer, little screw, into the round pocket, Phillips head, run it down. Second bearing, larger hole, shoulder screw, same deal, little washer. Well, this one had 2 washers on it, and it goes onto that hole. Same deal, finger to start it, flathead screwdriver, run it down. Or oriented like this. These surfaces on this blade roller are not straight. It's hard to see on camera, but this surface turns the blade from running even with the wheel to angled in the cut zone. So there's a little whoop-de-doo on that blade roller. Held in by 2 little screws, 2 little 1/4-20s, a shorty and a longie. And they just, the longie goes through the thick boss here, obviously, and the shorty through the thin one. On the lower roller, the same bolts that hold the roller on also hold on the little shoe. So same deal, except you had the shoe on. Line up the little holes. Upper wheel, nice blob of packing grease of your flavor of your choice, into the inner and outer roller bearings. Sorry, inner and outer needle bearings. Don't need a lot, just enough to grease them down. To get this on, move the eccentric cam with the lever so it's out. And first goes on the thrust bearing, which is just a plastic washer. Pushes past the equalizer bar here. And then on goes the upper wheel. And then you can release the tension, and you can see the upper wheel housing moving back and forth as I move the cam. Then the thrust bearing, which is just another little plastic washer, and a little screw. And snug her down. Now you notice when the tension is released, that equalizer bar is going to hold the wheel, so it won't turn with the tension released, but with the tension applied, it turns just fine. Okay, lower wheel. Start with the plastic thrust bearing and a little bit of the red and stinky grease. And you can take the chain wheel and kind of nest it with the chain sprocket, which have both been lubed up with the red and stinky grease. And then finagle the chain on there, like so. That, and then on goes the wheel with the tire installed. Again, grease the needle bearings, align that. Okay, once the blade wheel is installed, use the chopstick to just turn the wheel by hand, and you'll feel the chopstick drop into the threaded hole on the chain wheel. And then you can take your chain wheel screws and run them in. Okay, I'm one by one going around here with my number 3 Phillips, making sure that I'm drawing the chain wheel up onto the blade wheel. And in goes the outer thrust washer and the retention screw. And just run her down. Okay, handle. Start with a little 3/8 cap screw, like so, and then 2 number 10 Philister head. Now we can rewire the switch. So the speed selector switch is oriented this way. The two terminals towards the handle, 1 terminal towards the tension release. And we can thread our white and black wires through the cavity in the side of the motor housing. Through the little hole into the handle cavity, like so. Okay, now I scribed this switch for low and high to match the low and high on the side plate here. So now I'll just attach the switch to the side plate and then attach the side plate to the housing. Okay, you got all the wires routed and dressed in there, and start every one of these screws by hand. Just finger start them before you run any of them down, because this aluminum will just deform and you won't be able to get some of the screws in if you overdo it. So back underneath, I decided to reuse the blade channel. So that goes on, it's got a round hole and a slotted hole. So in the round hole, just an old number 10 flathead. And in the elongated hole in the back is a shoulder screw. That's because this channel has to move when the upper wheel housing goes back and forth to remove and install the blade. Just to demonstrate, you can watch the screw moving as I cycle the blade tensioning lever. Okay, the cord is going to crimp on. I just stripped a little 1/4 inch off the ends, and I'm just going to crimp on a couple of ring terminals. Run a quick pull test. Yep, we're good. A little bit heat shrink. Okay, the cord leads are wired to the switch. The motor leads are wired to the switch. It's important that these ring terminals be bent up so that you can route the power cord. So the paper, insulating paper, wraps around the whole thing. Then you got to dress these cables in here. Then the ground wire snakes down under the switch to the ground terminal right there. Okay, switch is held in by one number 8 screw. Ground wires dressed in. Paper insulator is wrapped around the back of the switch. Motor cables are dressed in. We're ready for the handle, the other half of the handle. Oh, strain relief is in place too, so we're ready for the other half of the handle. Make sure the strain relief is oriented. And then long screw here. Long screw here. Shorter screw here. Okay, to lubricate it, I'm just going to use Skill Saw oil, which is a heavy gear lube. Squirt in a few ounces there. That looks about right. And replace the oil plug. Front handle. And last but not least, install the blade. Looks about right. Okay, and then tension the blade. Ready for action. First cut, piece of junk plywood. Second cut, piece of junk tubing. So there she is, all done. Good as new. Got that thing off eBay, and now we got a rebuilt, fully functional, just as good as anything else you can get, portable bandsaw. I'll make a couple other modifications to this down the line. I want to replace that shoe and maybe make a table for it, and probably replace the blade guide on the other side, something a little bit more beefy, but that'll be later. So I'm going to get a couple new blades for it, a couple new tires for it, and she's going in service. So on to the next project.